welcome. I'm Lucia Lee. I'm an educator and creative writer.
And I'm JT Neal. I'm an organizer, writer, poli-sci nerd, and just a general geek.
And you're listening to What's Wrong,
What's
Baltimore?
Wrong, Baltimore?
We're still trying to get that together, but we'll
It's
get
cute.
there. This episode, we are talking about DEI in terms of training, workshops, and initiatives here in Baltimore City. As a guest to talk about their own experiences and stories, we have Rosa, an educator, a dogma.
Hello.
And we have Grant, also an educator and a teaching artist.
Hello, how are you?
Just doing a little background. Of course, we know it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's just this umbrella term that has been used in professional spaces to address issues of culture and discrimination and racism. Lately, I feel like there has been definitely a pushback against DEI for conservative from conservatives, saying that it's like a form of indoctrination. This is like along the same vein as pushback against books and critical race theory. But in the midst of all this, I wanted to address what it looks like here in Baltimore City. So my first question to my guests, Rosa and Grant, is just, could you share with us some general experiences that you've had with DEI here in Baltimore in your respective roles?
I've been teaching for about 5 years now. My first 2 years were with Baltimore City Public Schools until I was unfortunately the victim of some unjust practices, and now I teach in Anne Arundel County Public Schools, so some of my information and experiences is a little dated. However, I've now been in two districts within the state of Maryland that in one case, one of these school locations was literally at the border of Baltimore City and was what's considered the county. And I would say that DEI's success is definitely contingent on investment in the search and demand of equity. If that's lacking, if it's more about the performance and clicking that checkbox, then it ends up being a self-congratulating like pat on the back for those involved.
I was interested to hear more about the terms that you used about search and demand for equity. Would you mind kind of elaborating on that?
I think ultimately a lot of us go through the school systems trying to search for our sense of belonging and self. And unfortunately, the public school system is not actually set up to support that for every single scholar within their halls, within their buildings. And as we develop and get older, there's a switch where we start demanding being treated as human and worth the dignity of a powerful, empowering education where regardless of my dream, I know that I'm capable of taking the steps necessary to achieve it. And I don't think that's happening in a lot of spaces. So we've got kiddos who are searching and searching and searching, and it's not until in some cases they are in their secondary education away at college that they find the vocabulary and the safety capable of expressing their frustrations about their educational experiences, and then they've got the tools to demand it. And often you see a lot of people who were traumatized by their education go back into education, ultimately with the goal of trying to help students further along than they received help.
That's really cool that you put it in that way, because there's a understanding of DEI initiatives as addressing culture issues, which is a static way of thinking about it. But when you say it, you're saying it's got to be actions that are available to students. So like self-advocacy. Grant, would you like to share about your professional background and your experiences?
I actually started out just working in after school recreational setting with students in Baltimore City, and then I kind of moved on towards in school tutoring with various nonprofits around Baltimore City that are affiliated with Baltimore City Public Schools. And now I'm currently employed with Baltimore City Public Schools, and I work as a teaching artist, teaching music production during the summertime, full time. No one's saying that DEI should be completely taken off the agenda. I feel like it's absolutely necessary, and especially dealing with students who are suffering from trauma and dealing with educators who might be coming from more relative privilege, and so they might not be aware even of the issues that they might be facing. I think the issue that we deal with is when we take those things that those teachers need to address, and we have this expectation that all teachers, no matter background, no matter their relative position and privilege in society, they also have to be held accountable to these same exact standards, and they also have to have these same exact conversations that might not necessarily be as necessary for someone who is coming from a neighborhood that is dealing with that active trauma and dealing with this program that's designed to teach people who are experiencing these issues or seeing these issues for the first time possibly in their whole lives. And I feel like there is where I think a major discrepancy lies.
So you're saying that there's just one DEI program for both people within the community who are familiar with the issues students might be facing, and then people who are from privilege who might not know what they're walking into.
Yeah, and also I think a lot of times in these programs or trainings, it often falls on the people of color to like basically be moderating these discussions just because of the nature of their experience. They end up having to lead those conversations. I just don't think that's fair, because why should I, as just another hourly employee, just like this other person, be having to like now lead a discussion where I'm not being given any kind of particular job title or anything like that?
Would you say you've had similar experiences, Rosa, with like an unequal expectation for the work that you have to put in as opposed to, let's say, someone who's not a person of color?
I would say yes, that education is centering a lot of whiteness in both its curriculum to its institutional values to also how we're actually addressing conversations of diversity inclusion. It's an interesting thing to witness because my first school, the majority of staff were all Black women, which is a very unique situation. We did affinity groups, and at a certain point, like I had a level of comfortability where I felt that I could speak up against the injustice that I was witness to within the school space specifically. When I was willing to call out that behavior, it then became a conversation around, I have an issue with tonnage, or this isn't an appropriate place to have these conversations where we're naming the actual actions that are a result of ignorance and complacency within the system. And I found myself heavily policed by someone who was a Black woman, but ultimately was very uncomfortable with the idea of calling out these behaviors, because I think what ends up happening in practice is we want these conversations, and I say we as in our district wants these conversations occurring because as we're coming an even more multicultural nation, we're seeing our kids like really struggle to keep up with global expectations of how do we interact as citizens. We see these admins wanting to have these conversations, but ultimately don't want to put in the work outside of the conversation. They don't want to name the actual things that we are witness to because it's uncomfortable. And in that moment, we're continuing to shelter white feelings. And then I moved to a school in Anne Arundel County where it sits on the border of Baltimore and the county. And it was a magnet school that was busing in kids because it had a performing arts portion to the school. And we were arts integration. This is a school that was attempting to have these conversations, but I still saw struggle with the actionable steps. And they ended up implementing affinity groups because our BIPOC teachers of color were just saying, you know what, we're doing a lot of work. You started a Unity Day training because that's an initiative in Anne Arundel County, something called Unity Days, where the kids go home early and the teachers have to stay for DEI training that's supposed to be very much site centered. The BIPOC teachers were saying this is a lot, because at one point they had us come in and it was after a recent Black murder that had been in the news, and they started the meeting with just giving us this man's life story and the fact that his life has come to an end in such a brutal way, literally the day before. And then they expected us to then teach and then come back to conversations about addressing racism in the school, and didn't recognize the emotional weight that they were putting on their educators, who then were the ones guiding the conversations. So we ended up having affinity groups, but ultimately it was still conversation.
Right.
It was conversation. When I would go to administrators or folks who were on administrative levels without the pay or department chairs about a teacher, a white teacher who was over differentiating his work to the extent that like his special ed students were getting fill in the blank sentences in the 8th grade. And that's not what their IEPs were saying. His class was passing every single kid, kids who were failing every single other class except his with an A. When I would go to speak up and say, this is a problem. You're actually communicating to the students that you're not invested in their education and that you don't think they're capable of actually participating in their own education when you're doing the work for them. And my admin pushed back on me saying that like it was very uncomfortable. They didn't want to name people. And I'm like, we don't have to name the person. We can name the action and like give examples of this and say as a whole staff, we're not going to lower expectations for our Black and brown children because there's this idea that our students aren't capable. So we need to lower that bar as opposed to making sure that we plan to give them the proper tools to reach our highest expectations. And now I'm at a whole different school, is majority white. I would say is not as invested in these conversations at all. And it's almost like it's stuck in a conversation loop. These are the problems, these are the problems, these are the problems. But what are the steps to actually addressing them? And how do we give students back agency in this situation? Student governments, I am sure, like you've seen at your different school sites, student governments have been becoming weaker and weaker. Kids don't actually have an interest in giving themselves a voice anymore around their school because they don't believe that it matters. And we're communicating that in middle school. By middle school, we've already communicated to that extent that our kids' educations are not our actual priority. It's these conversations about, did you meet your checkbox? Yeah, that feels like a very long rant.
No,
But
no,
I've
that's
definitely seen like these different stages because I went from a hyper evolved, very small school environment that had an emphasis on restorative justice, and I've seen how it can be further diluted. And even within the same county, how that message, depending on the admin commitment to addressing the underlying roots, how it can play out. And it's not coincidental that this admin is my whitest admin ever. It's an all-white admin.
yeah, not a coincidence.
I mean, I think it definitely speaks to the fact that there's a comfortability about what they're willing to engage in, and they're comfortable engaging in conversation. But
That's it.
because conversation doesn't actually mean anything unless you own your behaviors and shift them. Like if we're going to say we're moving towards restorative justice in the school system, how are we owning our roles? How are we moving forward?
Very true. Out of curiosity, I come from a family of educators. My mom has been a teacher for over 20 years now. I walk us through what does that day training look like? If it's even a day training, because it might just be like something you do online. But what does it look like when your admin says, okay, we're doing DEI today? What's that conversation look like from beginning to end?
I would say in my experience, generally it's been in the form of like discussion, online, Zoom, or face-to-face interaction conversations. And the conversations usually entail discussing the historical issues that have kind of held back students of color or students of various
Like oppressed identities.
Yeah, exactly. Specifically within Baltimore City, that's usually a pretty emotionally intensive process to get through that whole history because it's traumatic. It is very frustrating and it is emotionally taxing to just learn about. And that being said, I do think that these conversations are absolutely necessary. I would say that anyone working with students in Baltimore City, you should be aware of those things and you should be aware of what it is that's caused us to get to the point that we are right now. And it's oftentimes frustrating because we are talking about the issues and the things that have happened, but what are we gonna do to address the things that happen daily? You know, the issues with various educators that we have working with our students right now. We don't ever really take the time to address that side of the issue, in my experience.
Just to clarify, some of the training or the professional development would entail just like history lesson or like an article on redlining and things of that nature,
Yeah,
segregation in education.
exactly. hmm And, you know, people who are not educators should also be talking about these things, and those things are relevant to them as well.
If I may, because it's just like cross-referencing what it is that you're saying and what Rosa said, it sounds like, at least in Baltimore, in the city and the county, it seems like DEI is a contextless conversation or a contextless acknowledgement of history. Because I'm gathering that you're both noticing or you both have experienced a conversation where someone's like, this bad thing is happening, but there's no context about why we're even talking about it or what it is that we're going to do about it or how it should be changing our actions individually or as like a cohesive unit. As someone who has had to put on different trainings at different times for different people, is this training here for all of us? Is this training here for some of us? And what are we collectively supposed to be doing because of the training? And so I'm wondering if, like, has anybody had a DEI training that was not just, here's some bad stuff that happened?
Yeah, I would say that I've had some experiences with that, but generally speaking, it is like a lot of the here's the history of slavery and here's how that has basically been to the detriment of Black students to this day. And so much so to the point that like I've been in discussion groups with other Black men who have just been completely resistant to having this conversation because it's clearly triggering for them to talk about these things, especially without giving any kind of like, well, here's what we can do about this specific situation. And I have to kind of empathize with the other person in that situation. I have to ask, is this the best kind of conversation for this person to be having? Is it really helping or hurting this particular individual be a better educator even?
One last question, because I'm very curious. Has the training the both of you had, has it mainly just been about white people and Black people and like that's the nature of the race conversation, that's the nature of the diversity conversation? Does it
Yes,
actually
in my
extend?
experience, yes.
Well, I was just going to say in Baltimore City, yes, that was the conversation that we were engaging with because our school population was 99% Black women because it was an all girls middle school in the city. When I moved out into the county, there is an opening of that conversation to include Latinx identifying folks. However, it is more of like a plus at the end. We're really talking about white, Black, plus because there is an uncomfortableness around like the nuances of these conversations. A lot of my experiences have been ones where these folks are not necessarily talking about the intersectionality of identity and the role it can play in experience. And it's definitely presented as like this dichotomy that we're engaging with instead of like, no, this is a conversation about a system that makes no sense when we try to include objectivism because it's built on this idea of a made-up system that made it possible for us to justify the transatlantic slave trade and the inhumanities present within that slave trade. And we've kind of just like shoehorned in other identities as we've gone along, as opposed to having this a full conversation about how has race impacted who we are in the United States? How have people of color's communities been pitted against each other in multiple instances? Because we don't have conversations about what is the power in these situations. It's easier to say, though, this is a Black-white issue rather than acknowledging, no, there's transphobia thrown into there. There's some Islamophobia you're also including in these actions and words that you're spreading. And I would say some of the schools that I was at, it wasn't just here's reading that traumatic event. It was also, let's take a look at our suspension data and muse on why our data can look like this. I'm not an administrator. I actually have no role in deciding how these write-ups are being administered and consequenced out. I can say this was a problem in my classroom, and I can reflect on what steps did I take to get to that point where I actually had to write a report to invite someone else into my classroom space, because I am not capable of recognizing how I contributed to a situation that is not healthy for me or the student. It's an interesting conversation in terms of, we'll muse what could potentially be the reasoning why we are suspending more of our Black students on average. Also, if we layer in IEPs in there, you'll see that we're actually suspending a good portion of our students with IEPs. I'm like, yeah, we're doing that. So what are the next steps? We've now mused on it. What are the next steps? Because I don't assign consequences. I don't want to write any administrator a write-up, because that means that it's no longer in my hands, and the consequences are going to be a stern talking to by a figure that has no idea of what the classroom is like, or it's going to be a consequence that has them in a room somewhere in our building, sitting and staring at the wall for a good portion of the day, missing my lessons, or at home missing my lessons. And ultimately, like, it comes down to a structural issue. What are the restorative practices that you're placing in this classroom? If I had an issue with a scholar where I felt that scholar was disrespectful to the extent that I'm writing a report on it and saying, hey, we need to address this, why isn't it ever a first step that we have a restorative conference with me and the scholar? Why do I have to seek that out versus like, no, that's actually your first step, because we value how we can repair this relationship. It ends up being a lot of like, did we do our reading? Did we watch our Brene Brown video? Did we muse on what's going on in our school? Okay, give us feedback at the how can we do better? I just did that this week at a Unity Day training. We had a conversation about how students want to fit in rather than belong, and what's the difference between fitting in and belonging. And then we looked at a different set of posters and named issues that our scholars may find challenging or inequitable. And I will never see any of that again, ever. It will not be addressed, I promise you that.
Yeah.
Because we've now had this training. It happens at least once a quarter. We've now had it 2 times before. We have never circled back to the conversations that we started before. They're just jointed meetings of like, okay, here's the problem issue. Did we watch our video? Did we have our conversation relating it to our school site? Okay. Done.
It's so disconnected.
I wanted to touch on what you were saying again, JT, about the issues of black and white in Baltimore City public schools. Growing up, Baltimore is not really a real urban metropolitan center like some other major cities in America, where you might see intermingling cultures all coming together. But we generally have historically had mostly white and black in Baltimore City. The problem with that is that it leaves a major blind spot, I think, for our other students of other cultures. I would say that not only just for the teachers, but for the students as well. Unfortunately, I don't really see a lot of solidarity between Blacks and Latinos in Baltimore City. My work with students started with Spanish-speaking students who literally could not speak English. And even that experience, I would say that we don't have a lot of solidarity between Blacks and Latinos in Baltimore. We just have an enormous blind spot, and people, as Rosa pointed out, are afraid to talk about nuance. But it's like they're uncomfortable. It's something about it. It's just like they don't want to do it. That just creates issues.
I feel like it makes people feel even more out of control about the situation, but that's the experience of BIPOC folks. This lack of control and feeling like our lives are impacted by something that we couldn't change if we wanted to. It's core tenets of who we are. But that doesn't mean that every time I walk out of my home, I'm not being acted upon by other bodies and voices that are prioritized over mine. Even from some of like the most ardent of supporters, there's this uncomfortable nature to it. My existence is proof as a mixed race person how whiteness can be accepting, but it doesn't get rid of like underlying racism. Like, my mom still would say the N-word and it would be utterly disgusting. But because she had children of color, she almost like wrote herself that little ticket off. You know, in a lot of ways for educators, being able to say, well, I participate in DEI conversations gives them the excuse to write off some of their other behaviors. I was substituting a class on Friday and I hear through the wall clear as day, because my school doesn't have real walls. We're a partition school. But I hear through the partition wall as I'm substituting this reading intervention class, shut your damn mouth. And it's this white woman yelling at her majority POC class. And I hear this through the wall. And this is someone in a place of authority who's in charge of our National Honor Society junior whatever version. And it makes sense why that club space is a particularly white club space. There's these things where she gets to feel good about herself, but also doesn't recognize like how that toxicity in a classroom is in no way helpful for the student, regardless of whether or not they're frustrating the heck out of you. I think we can all say we've all had a kid that has frustrated us past our last rope. You're just through the roof. But I could never imagine cussing at a kid and making them feel that low. If I've ever made a scholar feel that low, you best bet I've held them back and talked with them and apologized because I've clearly let my own issues pour out onto them. I've publicly apologized because I'm human and I make mistakes, but just hearing that and knowing that there was no end to that, I heard her kick that kid out of her classroom. How does that say that's a safe space for you when you have to go in every single day to learn math? I don't think I could recover. I didn't recover when a teacher accused me of cheating in the 8th grade. Like, I still remember that teacher, and I still remember feeling like nothing I could do would ever be proof enough that, like, I'm deserving of praise because I was never believed of being able to produce the work myself. And that wasn't the case. It can be hard to witness that and also recognize, like, I am only one part of this problem and I don't have a lot of power over it. Like, I can't walk into that woman's classroom and say, that's not an appropriate way to interact with your students at all. Like, if you need a moment to step out, take that moment. You should not be teaching. You shouldn't be talking to a kid like that.
I think at that moment, there's no control over even yourself. How are you going to regain any kind of like calmness in your space, in your classroom space?
And that's a celebrated educator who's been teaching for 15 plus years. Those are supposed to be your mentors.
Yeah, I take for granted, because again, my mom is a teacher, my grandmother taught, both of my aunts are teaching right now at the collegiate level, and I take for granted the background I have, because like you say that, and my first thought was if I were in your position, I would go and be like, you can't do this. This is completely unacceptable behavior. Like, they're actual children. A kid's job in order to grow up is to emulate the things around them. You as an educator, you as a teacher, you as someone who is supposed to be passing on knowledge and behavior, you would be furious if they said that to you. So why would you say that to them, right? Like, my first thought is like, even if I were a substitute, just my background, just knowing, having grown up where these are the kinds of discussions that were had, old school discussions, because again, I'm in the South, right? I'm further south than Baltimore. You know, old Black educators are like, no, you're a professional to a fault. You don't do that to children because they're children.
I can see that being like the immediate impulse, but then the long-term results of stepping in might not be, because this seems like someone who's like a lauded teacher.
Oh, she would be furious.
Yeah.
Oh, she would probably go to the office and try to get me kicked out, right? Like,
it wouldn't even really make a
I felt the long-term effects of speaking up when you've
for sure
witnessed that, and it's made me more hesitant. I've found that teachers who are willing to call out these issues and how they actually manifest in our spaces are the ones that are pushed out of education the quickest, because like you are putting in that energy and work that otherwise is not going to be appreciated and is actively challenging a lot of people's authority, because we see authority and power as like this very finite thing as opposed to a shared responsibility. It becomes this competition almost.
The power struggle.
It makes me hesitant to speak up because I don't want to lose what little voice I do have.
Just cutting in here to say that this episode will be released in 2 parts, and that concludes the first. So the second portion will be released Tuesday, March 19th, where you can hear us talk about how equity isn't just talking about race, it's also about providing basic resources for health and safety and ways to improve these DEI initiatives. In the meantime, please consider supporting our podcast on Patreon. JT and I have been putting in hours of work into our content, and we hope to release all of that really soon. Even just $5 would be extremely helpful for us given the hours of research and producing and editing that we have to put into this. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, we are always out here out of love. Let us know what's bothering you, Baltimore. Maybe we can address it next time, and send us an email at what's.wrong.bemore@gmail.com or DM us in our socials. On Instagram, you can find us at what's.wrong.bemore. And be safe. Take care. We'll see you next time.